At the center of the largest private dining table in Palm Beach, a woman in her 70s sat alone. Footmen stood along the walls. A butler leaned close to her shoulder because she was going deaf and named each guest as they came so that she could greet them by name. On the sideboard behind her lay gilded plates that had once belonged to an emperor. And in a house up in Washington, there hung a wedding crown taken from an empress who had been shot in a cellar with her children. Marjorie Merriweather Post owned all of it. She had built the greatest private palace in America, 118 rooms between the ocean and the lake. And she had married 4 times, and 4 times the marriage had ended. And still the palace only grew. What was a fortune for, if this was the room it bought? If you love the private cost hidden underneath the public glamour, subscribe and stay close, because the true story of Marjorie Post is grander and lonelier, and far more formidable than any palace she ever raised. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Learned an Empire. Before she owned a palace with 118 rooms, she folded cereal boxes in a Michigan barn, while her father, a man who kept breaking, built a fortune out of grain and out of his own raw nerves. That truth sits at the root of Marjorie Merriweather Post, and almost everyone who later watched her reign over Palm Beach forgot it. The richest woman in America began life a long way from riches. She was born in Springfield, Illinois, in the spring of 1887, the only child of a couple who were, at that moment, one more failure away from nothing at all. Her father was Charles Post, and he is where the story of the money begins, because for the first quarter of Marjorie's life, he was the story, and she was the girl at his elbow, watching and learning. Charles Post was a restless, gifted, failing man. He had sold farm machinery and rifles and sewing machines. He had designed suspenders and bicycle parts and rolls of paper for player pianos. He had built a machinery works in Springfield and watched it collapse. And in the very year his daughter was born, the family packed up and moved to Texas, chasing the next chance because the last one had come to nothing. He was a man who could imagine anything and hold on to almost none of it, and the imagining cost him dearly, because his mind was fragile in a way the century had no gentle word for. He broke down again and again. The tally the historians settled on was 7 nervous collapses across his life, 7 separate times that a brilliant, anxious, exhausted man simply could not go on. One of the worst of them brought the whole family north to Michigan, to the town of Battle Creek, where 2 brothers named Kellogg ran a famous sanitarium and promised cures for the nervous and the sleepless and the despairing. Battle Creek was the strange spiritual capital of a whole American obsession, the health of the body, the science of digestion, the war on the ordinary miseries of the modern stomach. Rich neurasthenics came from across the country to be fed on strange diets and subjected to strange regimens, and out of that peculiar world of grain and gut and nervous exhaustion would come, almost by accident, one of the great fortunes of the age. Marjorie was 4 years old when her mother carried her along on that journey, and she grew up inside it, a solemn, watchful, only child in a household forever poised between collapse and reinvention. The Kellogg cure did little for her father in the end. By the family's account, it was faith that steadied him, a Christian science healer doing for Charles Post what the doctors could not, and that faith passed to his daughter and stayed with her to the very end of her long life, a belief in the power of mind over the weak and failing body that would one day shape how she treated the people she loved. But the money, when it came from grain, out of his own endless search for something that would settle his own stomach. Charles Post began roasting grain into a warm brown drink he sold as a substitute for coffee, a beverage for the nervous American gut. and he called it Postum. He incorporated his little company on the first day of 1895. Within a few years, he added a hard-baked cereal he named Grape Nuts, and then the toasted flakes of corn that would carry the family name into every kitchen in the nation. What happened next was one of the great fortunes of the American century, and it happened fast. Charles Post's real genius was salesmanship. He was one of the first men in America to grasp that making a product was only half the work, and that the other half was persuading the whole country it could not live without the thing he sold. He spent more than $1 million a year telling the nation that his cereals would cure its ailments and settle its stomach and steady its nerves. And the country believed him and bought. Grape nuts, his advertisements claimed, could cure all manner of ailments, appendicitis among them. And the claims grew so bold that a magazine attacked them and a court eventually fined him for it, after which the company grew a little quieter about what its cereals could cure. But the selling worked. Within roughly 10 years, the company was worth something near $10 million, and a man who had failed at everything was earning more than $1 million a year, and his daughter was growing up inside the machine that made it. The toasted cornflakes told the whole method in miniature. Charles Post first sold them under the name Elijah's Manna, a piece of biblical branding so bold that churchmen objected, and even a foreign government refused to allow the name onto its shelves, and so he simply renamed them Post Toasties and sold them by the trainload anyway. Battle Creek in those years was a boomtown of breakfast, a small Michigan city gone slightly mad on the promise that the right cereal could cure the modern body, and the Posts and the Kellogg's sat at the center of it as rivals and neighbors, two families quarreling over the future of the American morning. Out of that strange, striving, half-medical world, the Post fortune climbed, and it climbed on faith as much as on grain, on the faith that if a thing was promised loudly and often enough as a cure, people would believe the promise and they would buy. For the solemn only child watching all of it, the lesson sank in early and deep. She saw that image and belief could be manufactured, that a fortune could be conjured out of confidence and repetition, and that the whole shining apparatus rested at the bottom of it, on a man whose own nerves might give way at any moment. It made her watchful. It made her careful. It made her, above everything, a builder, a person who trusted structures and systems and order because she had seen, up close and young, how quickly the ground could open beneath a family that had none. She grew up the daughter of a self-made man who kept nearly breaking, braced, always braced, for the floor to give way beneath a family that money had not yet made safe. She was a serious child, and she grew into a serious young woman, with a gravity about her that never quite left. The finishing school in Washington polished her manners and her French and her music, and she took from it what she took from everything: a standard, a discipline, a sense of how a thing ought properly to be done. In later years, she would become the very first of that school's graduates to sit on its governing board, giving back to the place that had shaped her, because giving back was already stitched into her nature. But the deepest schooling had happened long before, in the plant and the barn and the boardroom, at her father's elbow. By the time she was a grown woman, she understood money and manufacture and management in a way that almost no woman of her class was permitted to understand anything at all, and she carried that knowledge quietly, a hidden engine humming underneath the gowns, waiting for the day it would finally be hers to use. And this is the part that shaped her, the part that set Marjorie Post apart from every other heiress of her age. Her father brought her in, right up close to the source of the money, where the old Fifth Avenue families would have kept a daughter at a decorous distance, folded in silk and ignorance. She was 10 years old when she began sitting in on the board meetings of the company, a small girl in a chair at the edge of the long table, listening to grown men argue about production and distribution and the price of oats. She worked in the plant. In later years, she remembered pasting the labels onto the jars with her own hands and folding the early boxes in the barn where the first work was done. Her father gave her stock in the company when she was still a girl, shares said to be worth some millions of dollars by the time she was 16. And more than the money, he gave her a way of standing in the world, the habit of treating the great fortune as a thing to be understood and managed and held in perfect order, and never merely spent. He gave her one other thing, a way of seeing herself that she carried her whole life and repeated as a joke against her own nature. If she were ever cast ashore on a desert island, her father once said, she would set about organizing the grains of sand. She told the line often in her grand years, because it was true, and because it had come from him. She had been raised to put things in order. Every jar labelled, every box folded, every figure known, everything in its place. It was the deepest lesson of her childhood, the discipline that would make her formidable beyond any woman of her time, and, in the end, the flaw that would break her heart, because the one thing in all the world that could never be labelled and filed and kept in its proper place was a man. She was educated to be a lady, as the size of the fortune now required. She was sent east to the Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, a finishing school for the daughters of the newly and enormously rich, and there she was polished in the accomplishments her world expected, languages and music and the arts of the drawing room. But the Polish sat on top of something the Polish could not reach, the barn and the boardroom and the labels and the ledgers, the bone-deep certainty that the company was hers in a way that went far past any stock certificate. She was a post. The name was printed on a box in every grocery in America, and it was her father's name, and it was hers. There was a shadow over the childhood, and it would grow, because her parents' marriage did not survive the fortune the two of them had built. In the autumn of 1904, when Marjorie was 17, Charles Post divorced her mother, Ella, and within weeks married his young secretary, or a woman named Layla, many years his junior. It was the first time Marjorie learned a lesson she would spend the rest of her life relearning in ever more painful forms, that money does not hold a marriage together, that a man may build an empire and still break the one promise that matters most, and that the wreckage of a marriage lands hardest of all on the child who did not choose it. Her mother would die a few years later, quietly, in her sleep, in Washington. Her father would not last a great deal longer than that. And the fortune, the great glittering fortune the two of them had made, would come to Marjorie in the very worst way that a fortune can come to anyone. Chapter 2. The gunshot that made her rich. On a spring day in 1914, in a house in Santa Barbara, Charles Post put a gun to himself and died, and a 27-year-old woman inherited a company and a wound she would carry in silence for the rest of her life. He was 59 years old. He had been ill for months with a pain in his stomach that nothing could name or ease. And there is a terrible irony folded into that ending, sharp enough that no storyteller would dare to invent it. The man had built his fortune selling cereals he advertised as cures for the ailments of the gut. Grape nuts, his advertising had once boasted, could help with appendicitis. And it was a stomach illness, a suspected appendicitis, that broke him at the last. He had been rushed clear across the country by a special chartered train to the finest surgeons in the land, opened up on an operating table, and still the pain would not lift, and in his despair, believing himself past all help, he ended it himself. Marjorie was his only child, and she had been closer to him than to any living person. She was the girl from the board table, the heir he had trained with his own hands, and now he was gone by his own hand, and she was left holding everything he had built and nothing at all of the man who had built it. She did not, so far as the record shows, ever speak openly about what that loss did to her. There are people who pour their grief out into the world and people who lock it away and build a life over the top of it. And Marjorie Post was, to the marrow, the second kind. She took the pain, and she did with it precisely what her father had trained her to do with everything else in her life. She put it in its place. She organized around it. And she went to work. The end had come on fast and strange. Late in his life, the pain in his stomach grew unbearable, and Charles Post was carried across the country in a chartered train that ran without stopping, all the way to the finest surgeons in the land, who opened him up and found nothing they could cure. He went home to California no better than before, and there, convinced he was past all help, he ended his own life. For Marjorie, the manner of it must have carried its own private horror. The father, who had built an empire on the promise of health, destroyed by an illness of the body he could not master. The great salesman, undone by the very thing he had once sold the country a cure for. She was 27, and she had lost the one person who had ever truly known her, and she never, in all the long decades that followed, let the world watch her grieve. What she did instead was harden into the shape she would keep for the rest of her days. Where another woman might have leaned on relatives or lawyers or simply retreated behind the high walls of her fortune, Marjorie took hold. She learned the company's affairs down to the detail. She fought her stepmother to a settlement and won. And she began, quietly and methodically, to build the ordered private world that would stand in for everything the loss had taken from her, because if she could not have her father back, she could at least have control, total and absolute, over everything that remained to her. The wound went underground, where she kept it. The will hardened over the top of it like a shell, and underneath that shell, the search began, though she would never have called it a search. She was 27 and alone at the center of an empire, and something in her went looking for the thing the empire could not supply. A person who belonged to her, the way the company belonged to her, permanently, unconditionally, past the reach of any accident or betrayal. She would spend the next 50 years looking, in 4 marriages, in a widening circle of houses and treasures and grand amusements, and she would never quite find it, because the thing she was looking for could not be acquired the way she acquired everything else. It had to be given freely, and it had to stay given, and that was the one transaction on earth over which even Marjorie Post held no control at all. The fortune that came down on her was enormous, and its exact size depends on who was doing the counting. The figure most often given is around $20 million, a sum that would be worth many hundreds of millions in the money of a later century, and some accounts push it higher still. Whatever the precise number, it made her, at 27, one of the wealthiest women in the United States, and quite possibly the wealthiest of them all. And it made her that, at a single stroke, in one Santa Barbara spring, at the price of her father's life. But the money did not come to her cleanly, and the first real fight of her adult life was over the will. Charles Post had divided control of the company between his daughter and his second wife, the young secretary he had married a decade before. Marjorie was not willing to share the thing her father had built and that she had grown up inside, and she disputed it. In the end, the 2 women settled without a courtroom. Layla surrendered her shares in the company in exchange for a payment of $6 million, an immense sum handed across to make a stepmother let go, and with that, the whole of the Postum Company passed into Marjorie's hands. At 27, she held all of it. The numbers, set side by side, make the scale clear. She was 27 years old. The fortune was reckoned near $20 million, a sum worth many hundreds of millions in the money of a later century. She had paid her stepmother $6 million to let go of her shares. The company her father had left her was already selling something close to $20 million of cereal and grain drink every year, and under Marjorie's ownership it would grow, across the length of her life, into a fortune valued near $250 million. She was, by almost any measure anyone cared to use, the richest woman in the United States, and she had become so in a single spring at 27, and entirely alone. And here is the strange, defining fact of her whole life, the deep contradiction that sits underneath the palaces and the jewels and everything that ever happened to her. She owned the company. She did not run it. And for a very long time she was not even permitted to sit at the table where it was run, and the reason was as simple and as immovable as a wall. She was a woman. This was the America of 1914. A woman might own a great corporation outright, might hold every controlling share and carry the founder's own name, and still be judged unfit to take a seat on its board of directors and speak for her own property in her own voice. The law and the custom of the age agreed, without argument, that a fortune of that size required a man to manage it. And so, from the very first day, Marjorie's interests inside her own company were carried by men who stood in her place. Her husband held her seat. When that marriage ended, a trusted friend was installed to hold it for her. She would spend 22 years like this, the sole owner who was not allowed to be the director. And that gap between the fortune she possessed and the power she was permitted to use is the pressure underneath everything she ever built. The effect on a woman of her particular gifts was cruel. Marjorie Post had the sharpest commercial mind in most rooms she entered, trained since childhood in the real workings of a real business, and she was told, in the one arena she cared about above all others, to sit quietly and let a man speak for her money. A lesser spirit might have surrendered to it. Marjorie did what women of her era who wanted power learned to do. She reached for it sideways. If she could not command the boardroom, she would command everything else within her reach, and she would build a private world so vast and so perfectly ordered that no man could ever chair it. She would collect and preside and organize on a scale the country had never seen. The compulsion her father had named, the need to set every grain of sand in its proper place, now had $20 million behind it and a fresh wound underneath it, and it went looking for somewhere to land. It would land, in time, on 4 different men. A young Connecticut lawyer she had already married, a titan of Wall Street, an ambitious diplomat, and one more man after that. Each time, she would try to build out of a marriage the single thing her money could not simply purchase, an equal at the center of her life, a person who was permanently and unshakably hers. And each time she would fail, and the failure would drive her to build something larger, some grander house, some greater collection, as if scale itself could fill the space a husband kept leaving empty. She was young, and she was grieving, and she was richer than almost anyone alive. She was also, though the word would have startled her contemporaries, profoundly alone. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. She had a fortune and a company, and no one at the center of it who belonged to her. The search that would shape the rest of her life had already quietly begun. Chapter 3. A first husband she outgrew. She had already married, in fact, years before the fortune fell on her, and she had married for something close to love, or at least for the settled, respectable life a young woman of her position was supposed to want. His name was Edward Close, and he was everything Charles Post's daughter was expected to marry. a handsome young lawyer from an old and proper Connecticut family, Greenwich people, the kind of established American gentry that knew serial money was meant to marry into and be quietly improved by. They wed in the winter of 1905, when Marjorie was 18, and for a while it was the life the world had drawn up for her before she was old enough to want a different one. 2 daughters came quickly. Adelaide was born in 1908 and Eleanor the year after, and Marjorie was, by the measure of her class, a young matron with a good name and a growing nursery, and a father whose fortune stood behind her like a fortress wall. On paper, it was everything a young woman could ask for. In practice, the marriage carried, almost from the start, a fault line that would only widen, and the fault line was Marjorie herself and the sheer size of what she was becoming. Edward Close was a conventional man, and there was nothing wrong with that, except that he had married a woman for whom convention was a cage with the door welded shut. He liked the settled rhythms of Greenwich society. He liked things arranged as they had always been arranged. And Charles Post, watching his son-in-law with the cold, clear eye of a man who had built an empire from nothing, reached an unsentimental verdict that Edward Close had no real appetite for leading the company and never would. In the House of Post, that came close to a disqualification. Charles had raised his daughter to think of the business as the beating centre of the world, and a husband who merely shrugged at it was a husband who had not truly understood what he married into. Then came the war, and it carried Edward Close off to France and left Marjorie alone in New York to discover who she was when there was no man standing at her side. When the United States entered the fighting in 1917, Close went into the army and served overseas as an officer, decorated, gone for the better part of 2 years. And in his absence, far from folding in on herself, Marjorie unfolded. She poured her fortune and her formidable energy into the war effort at a scale that astonished everyone around her. She paid for and equipped an entire military hospital in France, a vast facility that grew to hold thousands of beds, one of the largest such places the American effort put into the field, and she spent tens of thousands of dollars stocking it. When the first ship carrying her supplies was accidentally sunk in New York Harbor with everything aboard lost, she did not pause to mourn the loss. She simply sent the whole shipment again on the next vessel out. She rolled bandages, and she raised money, and she organized, always organized, and she discovered, in the middle of a world war, that she was magnificent at it. She also joined that autumn a delegation of women who went to the White House to press the president on the question of the vote. One more sign of a woman waking up to her own weight in the world. And she found in New York a new circle, sophisticated, artistic, ambitious people who looked at her and saw, instead of a Greenwich matron, a force, a woman of immense means and even greater capacity, who was only beginning to understand the reach of her own arm. Her biographer put it plainly. In her husband's long absence, Marjorie had grown steadily more independent, and the war, and the stretch of life lived on her own in the city, had let her begin to imagine an entirely different existence. She had married at 18 the man her world expected her to marry. She was now a woman past 30, who had run a hospital in a war, moved among artists and financiers, and discovered that the ceiling she had always assumed hung just above her head simply was not there, or need not be. The hospital itself shows the scale she already thought in. She equipped a base hospital in France that grew to hold thousands of beds, one of the largest the American effort put into the field, and she paid for it out of her own pocket. When the first ship carrying her supplies was sunk by accident in New York Harbor, every crate of it lost beneath the water, she simply sent the entire shipment again on the very next vessel out, because to Marjorie, a lost shipment was a problem to be solved and not a reason to grieve. France would remember the gesture. Long afterward, its government would make her a commander of the Legion of Honor, a soldier's decoration pinned on a serial heiress who had never once worn a uniform. There was more to those war years than bandages and supply ships. In the autumn of 1917, she joined a delegation of women who went directly to the White House to press the president on the question of the vote, a striking act for a woman of her class and her caution, and a sign of how far her sense of her own weight in the world had already travelled. And in New York, moving among the artists and financiers and reformers while her husband soldiered overseas, she found a life so much larger than Greenwich that Greenwich began to look, by comparison, like a pretty room she had already outgrown. When Edward Close came home, he found a woman transformed, a wife who had run a hospital in a war and glimpsed the true size of her own reach, and there was no folding her back down into the shape of a suburban matron. There were the two little girls to carry through all of it, Adelaide and Eleanor, and Marjorie kept them when the marriage ended, as mothers of her means could and did. She was, by the accounts that survive, a mother of enormous standards and a certain cool distance, a woman who loved her daughters and expected a great deal of them and was not always an easy person to be the child of. The pattern of her own restlessness would echo down into their lives, into marriages made and unmade many times over, and the family she built would carry, generation after generation, a little of the same searching that drove her. But that was for the years still to come. In 1919, she was simply a divorced woman with two young daughters, a very great fortune, and a growing certainty that the largest chapters of her life had not yet begun to be written. Edward Close came home a decorated hero to a wife who had outgrown him while he was away. What ended? It was distance, plain and unbridgeable, the gap between a conventional man and a woman who had grown too large for the frame he could offer. There was nothing here for the newspapers to feast on, no scandal, no betrayal, nothing dramatic at all. They divorced in 1919. Marjorie kept the daughters, and she walked out of that marriage as a woman who had chosen to leave, which was, in that age, its own small scandal. A rich young divorcee stepping away from a good marriage because the life inside it was simply not big enough to hold her. This first ending set the pattern and then broke it. It came about through growth, through a woman becoming too much for the shape that held her, and it spared her the discovery and the humiliation and the blackmail that the later endings would carry. That would not always be how it went. The men would get grander, the marriages would get stranger and sadder, and the endings would grow crueler with each one. But this first ending taught her something she would need for the rest of her life, that she could lose a husband and come out the other side of it larger, not smaller. She carried that lesson forward into a new decade and into the arms of the one man among the four who would come closest to being her true equal, the financier who would help her build an empire and who would leave the deepest wound any of the four would ever leave. There is a small footnote to the Close marriage, a reminder that these were real bloodlines that ran on into a world still familiar today. Edward Close would marry again after Marjorie, and his granddaughter by that later marriage would grow up to be the actress Glenn Close, a strand of Hollywood spun off from a marriage that Marjorie Post had long since walked away from. But that was the future. In 1919, Marjorie was a woman in her early 30s, twice a mother, freshly divorced, richer than almost anyone alive, and only beginning to understand what she might do with all of it. The finishing schoolgirl was gone. The Empress had not yet been crowned, and into that opening stepped Edward Hutton. Chapter 4. The Titan Who Chaired Her Board. The second husband was, at last, something close to a match. There was almost no step up in wealth available to a woman as rich as she already was. But Edward Hutton came with a real fortune and a real power of his own. His name was Edward Hutton, And everyone in America knew the name because it hung over one of the great brokerage houses of Wall Street, the firm that bore it. He was charming and shrewd and hungry, a financier of genuine gifts. And when he married Marjorie in the summer of 1920, he did the thing the first husband had never been willing or able to do. He took hold of the company with both hands. Together, they built an empire out of the cereal business. And this was the partnership that truly mattered, the one that turned a family firm into a national giant. Hutton took the Postum Company public, and then he and Marjorie set out on a decade-long campaign of acquisition that swallowed some of the most familiar names in the American kitchen, one after another, after another. Jell-O came in. The Maxwell House coffee business came in. Baker's chocolate, log cabin syrup, Calumet baking powder, the mayonnaise the whole country spread on its bread, brand after brand after brand, until the modest cereal company had become something the country had never quite seen before. A single vast corporation whose products reached into nearly every pantry in the nation. In 1929, they gave the giant its new name. The Postum Company became the General Foods Corporation, the largest food company in the United States, and Marjorie Post owned the controlling share of the whole of it. And the single most important acquisition in that whole campaign was her own doing. The story has been told so many times it has taken on the shine of legend, but the core of it is documented and true. And it is the clearest proof there ever was of the mind that lived underneath the jewels. Marjorie was cruising off the coast of New England when the cook aboard her ship served up a goose that had been frozen, then thawed, then roasted. And she was struck to the core by how fresh it tasted, how completely unlike the grim, mealy, frozen food of the age. She asked where it had come from. The answer led her to a man named Clarence Birdseye, an inventor who had learned a way of freezing food so fast that it kept its texture and its flavor, a trick he had picked up watching the fishermen of the frozen north pull fish from the ice. Marjorie understood at once what she was looking at. She was looking at the future of how an entire nation would eat. Her husband could not see it. Hutton resisted the idea for years, unconvinced that any American housewife would ever buy frozen food, unwilling to spend real money on a technology the market did not yet want. Marjorie kept pushing. She had wanted the thing for a modest sum at first, and the longer Hutton delayed, the more it cost, until at last, in 1929, General Foods bought the Birdseye business for a sum around $22 million, an enormous price for a company the market still did not understand. It remade the American kitchen, and it proved her right for the rest of the century. The frozen aisle in every grocery store on Earth traces back, in part, to a rich woman who tasted a goose on a boat and grasped what her financier husband could not. She was a genuine commercial force inside the company, whenever the company would let her be, the instinct of a born operator hidden behind the gowns and the pearls. The pace of the building was ferocious. Through the 1920s, the company reached out and took name after name that Americans already trusted. The gelatin dessert in every icebox, the coffee in every percolator, the chocolate and the syrup and the baking powder and the mayonnaise, folding them one by one into a single great combine until a family cereal firm had become the largest food company in the entire United States. Marjorie sat at the center of all of it as the owner, watching her second husband run the machine she had inherited. And for a time, the partnership looked like the answer to the whole puzzle of her life, a marriage and a company fused into one. A man at her side who was finally, genuinely interested in the business her father had built. There was a new daughter in these years too, Nedenia, born in the middle of the decade, a girl who would one day shed the family name for the stage and become the actress Dinah Merrill, the only one of the three daughters to win a fame the public could see. And there was more money than the age had any real use for. Money enough to build palaces and to float the largest sailing yacht in the world. From the outside, it looked like the very summit of the American century, a golden couple at the head of a golden empire. From the inside, there was already the small, cold fact that Marjorie could not sit on the board of the company she owned, that her husband spoke for her fortune while she looked on, and that fact, small and quiet for now, would one day grow loud enough to bring the whole thing down. The frozen food gamble shows the true reach of her judgment. When she pressed her husband to buy the little company that could freeze a fish or a goose and hold it fresh for months, she was reading the market a full decade ahead of the men around her. She could see the day when a working family might keep good food through a long winter, when a housewife might set a decent meal on the table without a whole morning spent at the butcher and the greengrocer. It took years for the country to catch up to what she had understood in a single bite on the deck of a boat. But it did catch up, and the frozen aisle became one of the ordinary miracles of the modern kitchen. And it stood there, in part, because a woman the age would not permit to sit on a board had overruled the men who did sit on it, and turned out to be entirely right. But the company still would not fully let her be, and here the deep contradiction of her life pressed hardest of all. Even now, married to the very man who chaired her board, she did not sit on that board herself. Edward Hutton held the chairmanship of the General Foods Corporation, the company Marjorie owned outright, and she watched her husband preside over her own property from a seat she was not permitted to take. She had found the bird's eye deal. She had the sharper eye and the surer instinct. And still, in the one room where the real decisions were made, her voice reached the table only through him. She owned the empire, and her husband ran it. And from the outside, the arrangement looked like a perfect partnership, and carried, on the inside, a quiet humiliation that would only become fully clear on the day the marriage that housed it came apart. For now, though, it did not look as if it would ever come apart. This was the glittering decade, the high peak of the whole long ascent. There was a third daughter now, Nadania, born in 1923, a girl who would grow up to become the film actress the world would know as Dinah Merrill, the only one of Marjorie's children to make a public name entirely her own. There was more money than the age could quite take in. There were parties and yachts and the beginnings of a court, and there was, rising out of the sand in Florida, out of Marjorie's own vision and her husband's checkbook, the thing that would define her forever, the greatest private house that America had ever seen. She had told Edward Hutton, so the story goes, that she wanted to build a modest little place by the sea. What rose instead would have 118 rooms, and it would still be standing and famous a full century later. The empire stood at its height. The fall had not begun. But the palace was already climbing into the Florida sky, and the palace, in the end, would be the loneliest thing she ever made. Chapter 5. The Little Cottage by the Sea. She told her husband she wanted a little cottage by the sea, and what rose out of the Florida sand was 118 rooms of Spanish tile and gold leaf, standing on a strip of land between the Atlantic Ocean and the waters of Lake Worth. She named it for exactly that, for the ribbon of Palm Beach it commanded from ocean to lake, and the name in Spanish said just that, from the sea to the lake. Mar-a-Lago. It took the better part of 4 years to build, from the early 1920s to its completion in 1927, and it consumed a fortune even by Marjorie's standards, a sum reported near $7 million in the money of the day, which is to say a colossal sum in the money of any age. The scale of it is hard to hold in the mind, and the numbers are the story. 600 workers laboured on the house. It rose to 118 rooms, with 58 bedrooms and 33 bathrooms, and it was crowned by a tower 75 feet high with an observation deck at the top, from which a person could see the ocean breaking on one side and the still lake lying on the other. Marjorie sent to Italy for boatloads of pale stone, 3 whole shiploads of Dorian limestone carried across the Atlantic. She stripped an old Spanish castle in Cuba of its treasures and had them shipped north. Some 20,000 roof tiles and 2,000 blocks of black and white marble for the floors. She laid in around 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, a number of them centuries old. There was gold leaf across the ceilings, and there were fixtures of gold in the bathrooms, and the great living room sat beneath a ceiling 42 feet high. To build it, she brought together an architect named Marion Wyeth, and, for the interiors, a Viennese theatrical designer named Joseph Urban, a man who had built dazzling sets for the great stage spectacles of the age and understood illusion and grandeur the way few living people did. Between them, they made something closer to a stage than a house, a private palace grander than most of the courts of Europe, raised for a family of serial money out of Battle Creek, Michigan. And this is the deeper truth of Mar-a-Lago, the thing underneath all the tile and the gold. It was the purest expression yet of the collector's instinct that had run in Marjorie since she labelled jars as a child. She did more than commission a house. She assembled it, out of the treasures of the old world, the way she would one day assemble a collection of imperial art, gathering and ordering and setting each rare thing exactly where it belonged, building the single greatest object she would ever own. The building of it was a spectacle in its own right. 4 years of labour, 600 workers swarming the sandbar between the ocean and the lake. Barges came up the coast heavy with Italian stone. Craftsmen laid the antique tiles one at a time, some of them older than the country they were being set into. The Viennese designer she had hired, a man who conjured whole worlds on a stage, gave her ceilings of gold and a great hall beneath a ceiling 42 feet high, and the tower climbed over all of it, 75 feet into the Florida sky, so that from the top, a person could stand and see the Atlantic on one hand and the still lake on the other, the whole estate spread out below like a small kingdom. It was theatre built to be lived in, a stage set that happened to have plumbing, and in its way, it was the truest thing she ever made because it showed exactly how she loved, in scale, in permanence, in the gathering of beautiful things into one flawlessly ordered place. Even Edward Hutton, no stranger to money, seemed to marvel at what his wife had conjured out of the sand. He liked to shrug the whole thing off with a line that has followed the house ever since. She had said she was going to build a little cottage by the sea, he would tell people, and then he would gesture at the palace around him. Look what we got. And Mar-a-Lago, for all its scale, was only the grandest jewel in a whole crown of houses. There was the great camp up in the Adirondack Mountains, Camp Topridge, a rustic empire of nearly 70 buildings strung along a ridge above a cold northern lake, where guests were carried up the steep slope on a private railway, and every single guest cabin came with its own dedicated butler. There would in time be a triplex apartment in New York of 54 rooms, said to be the largest apartment in the whole city, reached by its own private entrance and its own private elevator, so that Marjorie need never share a lobby with a lesser tenant. And there was the yacht, and the yacht was perhaps the purest thing she ever built. At the start of the 1930s, she built a sailing ship, a 4-masted bark, more than 300 feet long, and when it was launched, it was the largest private sailing yacht in the entire world. She threw herself into every plank and rivet of it. She took a course in marine engineering so that she could understand her own vessel from the keel up. She had full-sized wooden mock-ups of the interior cabins built inside a New York warehouse so that she could walk through the rooms before they existed and get every measurement precisely right. The taps in the owner's suite were shaped like golden swans. It was a floating palace, and it was entirely hers. And there is a story, impossible to fully verify, but too fitting to leave out, that a queen of Norway once stood on its deck, looked around at all of it, and said to Marjorie, "You live like a queen, don't you?" She did. She lived like no queen America had ever produced, in houses that outdid the royal houses of the old world, and on a ship that outsailed the yachts of kings. The great ship would go on to an astonishing life of its own. In the Second World War, Marjorie lent it to the government, and it went to sea as a naval vessel. And aboard it, the United States military ran one of its first crews of black and white sailors serving together as equals, a floating experiment in a country not yet ready for one, with a young painter named Jacob Lawrence among the hands. Years afterward, she would trade the ship away to a Caribbean dictator in exchange for an airplane. But in the 1930s, it was simply hers, the largest private sailing yacht in the world, a thing she had willed into being plank by plank, one more flawless object in a life assembled out of flawless objects. And still, the houses multiplied around her. In New York, there was the great triplex apartment high above Fifth Avenue, 54 rooms with its own private entrance, so that Marjorie need never share a door with a lesser tenant. There were the seasons that ordered her year like a court calendar: winter in Palm Beach, summer in the mountains, the rest of it split between Washington and New York, each house fully staffed and fully equipped and standing ready so that she could move from one to the next and find every single one of them humming and complete and waiting for her. It was a life of almost imperial scale, and it had been built, every inch of it, by a woman looking for something that no house on earth could hold. The palaces were the search made visible. Each one rose larger than the last, and each one was, at its heart, a place she was building for a marriage that kept refusing to fill it. And the whole magnificent apparatus, the palace and the camp and the great ship, was raised during the marriage to Hutton, built as the setting for a life the two of them were meant to live together at the very summit of the American century. The palace was intended to be the crown upon the partnership. Instead, it would outlast the partnership by decades, and it would spend most of those decades as the backdrop to its mistress's solitude, because even as the last gold leaf was being laid on the ceilings, the marriage the palace was built to celebrate had already begun, very quietly, to come apart. The grander the house grew, the more it became a stage set for a drama that had already, very quietly, begun. She had built the most beautiful rooms in America, and the emptiness waiting inside them was still years from making itself felt. Chapter 6. The tripwires she laid for him. To catch the man she loved in a lie, the richest woman in America got down to the level of her own floorboards and laid threads of fine silk and dustings of talcum powder across the rooms of her own house. It is one of the strangest and most human images in the whole story, and it is documented, and it tells the whole story of the box she was locked inside. Marjorie Post could buy anything, command anyone, raise a palace in 4 years out of nothing but her own will. She could not simply divorce a husband who was cheating on her because the law of the age would not allow it. And so the woman who organized empires was reduced to laying tripwires across her own home like a detective in a cheap novel. The trouble was Edward Hutton, and the trouble was other women. The charming financier who had built the empire at her side turned out to be a serial adulterer, and by the middle of the 1930s, his affairs had grown impossible for Marjorie to ignore any longer. The one that finally broke the marriage, by the account of her biographer, was close to home in the most humiliating way imaginable. Hutton had taken up with a member of the household staff, a maid who lived and worked under Marjorie's own roof. The betrayal was intimate and near, worked out inside the palace itself, among the very servants Marjorie ran with such precise and total control. The man who chaired her company had reached past his wife, the mistress of the greatest house in America, and taken up with the help. But knowing a thing and being able to act on it were two entirely different matters for a woman in that America. To win a divorce, a wife needed grounds, and in practice, the only reliable ground was hard proof of adultery, the kind of proof that would stand up and could not be waved away or bought off. And so Marjorie, betrayed inside her own home, set about gathering that proof herself, with the very same meticulous, organizing genius she brought to every other problem in her life. She laid little bells that would sound if a door was opened in the night. She stretched fine threads of silk across doorways that would break silently if someone passed through. She dusted talcum powder across the floors so that footprints would show in the morning, so that she could read, when she rose, exactly who had walked where in the dark. The mistress of Mar-a-Lago, the woman who set an emperor's plates on her table and dressed her footmen in tailored livery, crept through her own palace at night, laying traps for her own husband, because it was the only way the law of the age would ever let her be free of him. There is no image in the whole story that says more about the gap between what she owned and what she was allowed to do with it. There had been other cracks before the maid. The two of them had begun to pull apart on the largest questions of the age. As the country slid into the Depression, Marjorie moved toward the reforming spirit of the times, drawn to the new president and his promises, while Hutton, a man of Wall Street to the bone, loathed the whole direction of it and grumbled at his wife's spending on charity and on the endless building. The palace itself had strained them, its scale and its cost a standing quarrel between a man who watched money and a woman who commanded it. By the time the affair with the maid came to light, the marriage was already a house with its foundations shifting underfoot. The collapse was already well underway, and the betrayal only handed her, at last, the hard proof the law demanded to end a thing that was already ending. And it wounded her in a place the other divorces never reached. Hutton had been the one husband who was nearly her match, a man of real power and real gifts, the partner in the great work of her middle years, and some who knew her believed she had loved him more than any man save her own father. To be betrayed by that man, and betrayed with a servant, inside the very palace she had raised as the monument to their union, struck at something in her that never entirely healed. She would marry twice more. She would reign for another 40 years. But her biographer's judgment stands that the end of the Hutton marriage was a blow to her pride from which she never fully recovered, and it is the closest the record ever comes to showing the private cost underneath the public composure. And yet even in the depth of that wound, she did not come apart, and she did not let the world watch. She gathered her proof. She filed for her divorce. She kept her palace and her yacht and her name, and she walked out of the marriage upright, the way she walked out of everything, with the pain locked down where no one could reach it. It was the same discipline she had learned at her father's grave, the refusal to be seen broken, and it served her again now. The public saw only the grande dame moving serenely on into the next chapter of a glittering life. Hidden underneath were the maid, and the talcum powder scattered across the floors at night, and the love that had curdled into courtroom evidence, and the quiet, permanent lowering of the one wall she had ever let a man get behind. She got her proof. The marriage ended in 1935, and it did not end gently, and it did not end without a lasting cost to her. Her biographer records that the divorce from Hutton was a blow to Marjorie's pride, from which she never fully recovered, and that is a remarkable thing to say about a woman who would go on to 2 more marriages and nearly 40 more years of reign. Of all 4 husbands, Hutton was the one who came closest to being her genuine equal, the one some who knew her called the love of her life after her own father, and he had repaid her, inside the very house she had built as their monument by taking up with a servant. The wound of it went deep, far deeper than the public ever saw, because Marjorie did with this pain precisely what she had done with the pain of her father's death. She put it away. She organized around it. She presided over her houses and her parties and her collections, and she let no one see the size of the thing she was carrying. And she found, in the wreckage of it, one hard consolation, though it took a full year to arrive, and it came from an unexpected direction. The end of the marriage to Hutton meant the end of Hutton's grip on her boardroom. The man who had chaired the company she owned was now, at last, out of her house and out of her chair. For 22 years, she had owned General Foods and watched a succession of men speak for her at its table. Now, the last of them, the husband who had presided over her property while betraying her under her own roof, was gone, and into the space he left behind, Marjorie Post was about to do a thing she had never once been permitted to do in all the years since her father died. She was going to sit down at her own board table and speak, at long last, in her own voice, for her own property. The betrayal had cost her a husband. It was about to hand her back her company. Chapter 7. The board seat she finally took. In the spring of 1936, a woman who had owned one of the largest companies in America for 22 years finally sat down at its board table to speak, for the first time in her life, in her own voice, for her own property. The date was the 9th of April, and in the dry, unexcited language of the corporate record, something quietly historic happened. Marjorie Post, newly divorced, joined the board of directors of the General Foods Corporation, and for the first time she represented her own interests on that board, in place of a husband or an agent standing in for her. She was 49 years old. She had owned the company since she was 27. It had taken her 22 years and the collapse of a marriage to win a seat at a table she had owned outright the entire time. That fact is the beating heart of her whole story, the thing underneath the palaces and the jewels and the 4 wedding rings. For more than 2 decades, the richest woman in America, the sole owner of a national empire, the woman who had personally found the single deal that remade how the country ate, had been judged unfit to sit on the board of her own company. She had the sharpest mind in most rooms she entered. She owned the controlling share of the entire enterprise. And still, she was kept from the table for one reason and one reason only, that she was a woman, and the age simply could not imagine a woman speaking for millions of dollars in her own right. She is remembered now as the first woman to sit on that board, a genuine pioneer, and the word is accurate. But the pioneering carried a bitter price. She reached the table only when the husband who had been occupying her chair betrayed her badly enough to be thrown out of the marriage. Set it against the world she lived in, and the weight of it comes clear. This was a country where a married woman's very legal self had, within living memory, been folded into her husband's the moment she wed, her money and her property, and her signature absorbed into his, so that she all but ceased, in the eyes of the law, to be a person who could own a thing at all. That old logic had not vanished by 1914. It had merely softened into custom, into the unspoken certainty that a great fortune needed a man's hand upon it, and it was that custom, and no written law, that kept Marjorie out of her own boardroom for 22 years. She broke it in the end through sheer endurance, by outlasting every man who ever stood in her chair, and by being, when at last she sat down, plainly the best equipped person in the room. Once she had the seat, she used it. She proved a working director in earnest. She knew the business in her bones, from the barn and the board meetings of her girlhood, and she held her place through boom and depression and war, guarding the thing her father had made, and she had grown into the largest food company in the land. The company was the one relationship in her life that never failed her, never betrayed her, never had to be caught in a lie or watched as it declined. It simply endured, year after year, hers, and she gave it a steadfast loyalty she could never quite find a man worthy of. The 9th of April, 1936, marks the one clean victory in the long war between what Marjorie owned and what she was allowed to do with it. Everywhere else that war would drag on unwon. In her marriages, she would keep reaching for an equal partnership and keep coming up empty-handed. But in the boardroom, she had settled the question for good and all. She sat at the head of the company her father had built and she had carried, and no husband and no custom would ever again move her from it. She had waited 22 years, from the age of 27 to the age of 49, for a chair she had owned outright the entire time. When she finally took it, she took it to keep. For the next 2 decades, she was a fixture of the company at its very highest level, through the long depression that followed the crash, through a world war, through the great boom that came after. She sat on the board, she attended the meetings, she entertained the directors in her own grand rooms, and she watched the firm her father had begun with a roasted grain drink grow into a household giant whose brands sat in nearly every cupboard in the land. It was the one arena of her whole life where the story ran straight and true, where the things she built stayed built, and the loyalty she gave came back to her. Everywhere else there was the searching and the losing. Here there was only the steady, satisfying work of ownership, and she gave herself to it gladly, and it never once let her down. She would keep that seat for the rest of her active life, more than 20 years, until she stepped back near the end of the 1950s, and even then she stayed on as a director in an honoured emeritus role, still attending the shareholder meetings, still entertaining the board at her own house. The company was the one great continuity of her whole life, the thing her father had given her, and the thing no husband could ever take away. And once she finally had her own hand directly upon it, she never again let go. Through 4 marriages, the men came and the men went. The company stayed. And at long last, her seat at it was the one she should have held from the very beginning, at the head of the thing that carried her family's name into every kitchen in the land. There is a hard, clean lesson buried in this chapter, and it is the lesson the whole story keeps circling back to. Marjorie Post's tragedy came down to the gap between what she owned and what the world would let her control, a gap that had nothing at all to do with her ability or her wealth, both of which were beyond any question. That gap ran straight down the middle of her life. She closed it, in the boardroom, in 1936, through sheer persistence and one useful divorce. And she would spend the rest of her life trying to close the very same gap in her marriages, trying to build, out of a husband, the kind of equal partnership she had finally seized inside her company. There, the persistence would not be enough, and there was no useful divorce that could ever hand her what she wanted, because the thing she wanted from a marriage was the one thing in all the world that cannot be owned or organized or seized by force of will. She had taken her seat at the company table. The other table, the one at home, was the one that would never once stay set the way she needed it to be. But in the spring of 1936, Marjorie had no time for brooding. She was newly free and newly seated at her own board, and there was already a new man in her life, a tall, ambitious Washington lawyer with a taste for grandeur that ran close to her own. And he was about to carry her somewhere no serial heiress from Battle Creek had ever expected to go, into the very heart of Stalin's Russia, and into the strangest acquisition of her whole collecting life. She had married a financier and gotten an empire out of it. She was about to marry a diplomat and get the treasures of a murdered dynasty. Chapter 8. The Ambassador's Wife in Moscow. Weeks after one marriage ended, she began another. and within a year and a half, the serial heiress from Battle Creek found herself hosting formal dinners in the very heart of Stalin's Moscow, while the regime around her quietly sold her the bones of the empire it had destroyed. The new husband was Joseph Davies, a prominent Washington lawyer, a man who had run a federal agency and moved with ease through the corridors of national power. He had the one quality that could still impress a woman who owned nearly everything money could buy. He had access to the machinery of the nation itself. They married at the very end of 1935, only weeks after her divorce, and they honeymooned aboard the great sailing ship. And then Joseph Davies was handed the posting that would reshape Marjorie's collecting for the rest of her life. President Roosevelt made him the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. So it was that in the late 1930s, Marjorie Post came to be living in Moscow, the reigning American hostess inside a communist state, presiding over the ambassador's residence at Spaso House, and staging dinners of a splendor that must have seemed to arrive from another planet entirely. She set her tables with French and Russian porcelain, and banked them high with orchids flown in from abroad, and she entertained with the same exacting, total control she brought to Palm Beach, in a city where much of the population was hungry and afraid, and the shadow of the secret police fell across every conversation. The contrast is almost too stark to be believed. The very queen of American capitalism holding court in the capital of the revolution that had sworn to wipe from the earth everything she was and everything she owned. She saw the terror around her clearly enough. By the accounts that survive, she was privately appalled by the police state she was living inside, even as her husband would go on to write a book that defended the dictator and excused his show trials, a book Hollywood would later turn into a film. The wife saw the thing plainly. The husband talked himself into admiring it. The dinners at Spaso House became small legends of their own. Marjorie brought her whole genius for spectacle into the grey heart of the Soviet capital, flying in flowers and delicacies, dressing the tables in a splendor the hungry city outside had not seen in 20 years, entertaining diplomats and commissars alike beneath the chandeliers, while the terror ran its course beyond the walls. She managed all of it with the same total control she brought to Palm Beach, the same flat insistence that every plate and every flower sit exactly where it belonged, and the effect, in that place and that year, was almost dreamlike, a fragment of imperial abundance staged inside the very state that had sworn to abolish abundance forever. Her husband would leave a stranger legacy of those years. Joseph Davies came home an admirer of the regime, and he wrote a book defending the dictator and the terrible trials that were even then sending old revolutionaries to the wall. A book so favorable that Hollywood made a film of it during the war. Marjorie kept her own counsel. What she carried home from Moscow was a collection. The same desperate regime that jailed and shot its own people was quietly selling the confiscated glory of the old Russia to any foreigner with hard currency, and Marjorie had more of that than almost anyone alive. She bought steadily, shrewdly, at prices that would never come again, and every piece she carried out was a piece the revolution would otherwise have melted down or lost for good. The greatest treasures of a murdered world were changing hands for cash in the back rooms of a frightened city, and the serial heiress from Battle Creek was standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right amount of money. For all the strangeness of the setting, these were, for a while, good years in the marriage. Joseph Davies had carried her into the very center of world affairs, made her the hostess of an embassy at a hinge of history, and handed her the raw material of the greatest collection of her life. She was, in the late 1930s, at the height of her powers and her reach, an American empress presiding over dinners in the capital of the revolution, buying up the treasures of the Tsars by day and dining with the men of the new order by night. If any marriage could have been built to last on grandeur and shared adventure alone, this one might have managed it. But grandeur was never the thing Marjorie was short of, and adventure was never quite the thing she was truly looking for. And in time, the same quiet emptiness she carried into every marriage would open once more at the center of this one. And it was there, in Moscow, that Marjorie stumbled into the collecting opportunity of the century, and it came drenched in blood. The Soviet regime, desperate for hard foreign currency to fund its industrial ambitions and its armies, was doing a thing that would have been unthinkable to the people it had overthrown. It was selling off the confiscated treasures of the old Russia, the imperial treasures of the murdered Romanov dynasty, the sacred objects of the persecuted Orthodox Church, the accumulated splendor of centuries, selling all of it cheap for cash to any foreigner with the money and the nerve to buy. The art historian who later studied Marjorie's collection said it as plainly as it can be said. She was in Moscow at exactly the right moment, when Stalin and his government were selling off objects for hard currency in order to build up their armaments. Marjorie, standing in the middle of all this, understood at once what was in front of her, just as she had understood the frozen goose on the boat. She began to buy. She bought icons and chalices and porcelain. She bought the delicate works of the great imperial jeweler, and she carried out of Russia the beginnings of what would become the largest collection of Russian imperial art anywhere in the world outside Russia itself. Roughly a fifth of the whole vast collection she would eventually assemble came directly out of the Soviet Union in these very years, plucked from the state commission shops and the back rooms of dusty warehouses where the looted glory of a fallen empire sat stacked and waiting for a buyer with dollars in hand. And among the things that passed into her keeping was one object that runs through the rest of this story like a dark thread pulled tight. An object so charged with meaning that no storyteller would ever have dared to place it there on purpose. It was a wedding crown. It was the diamond nuptial crown of the last empress of all the Russias, the crown that Alexandra had worn on the day she married the last of the Tsars, a frame set with more than 1,500 diamonds made to sit on the head of an imperial bride at the very summit of the old world. Alexandra had worn it to her wedding, and Alexandra had been shot to death in the cellar of a house with her husband and her children around her. When the revolution finally came for the whole family, the dynasty ended in a single night of gunfire and quicklime. Now her wedding crown, the crown of a murdered bride, was being sold for hard cash by the very men who had done the murdering, and it was passing into the collection of an American woman who had already buried 2 of her own marriages and would go on to bury 2 more. Marjorie kept everything she gathered in perfect order. She catalogued and preserved and displayed. And now, into the great inventory of her life, alongside the companies and the houses and the jewels, came the wedding crown of a woman shot dead for being exactly who she was, a bride's crown for a collector who could never manage to stay a bride. She never spoke of the irony of it, if she saw it at all. She saw a treasure worth saving, and she was right that it was worth saving, for much of what she bought in those years would very likely have been melted down or lost had she not carried it away. But the crown had come into the house now, and it would still be hanging there in the quiet of a Washington museum long after Marjorie's own 4 marriages had followed the Romanovs into history. Every one of them ended, every one of them gone. Chapter 9. The Treasures of a Murdered Dynasty. She gathered nearly 90 pieces by the great imperial jeweler, 2 of the famous jeweled eggs, and the crown a murdered empress had worn on her wedding day, and she assembled the whole of it with the collector's genius that had run in her since she labelled jars in a Michigan barn. The Russian collection became the passion of her later life, and it swelled far beyond the things she had first carried out of Moscow. For decades afterward, she went on acquiring, at the great auctions in New York and Paris, from dealers and from other collectors who could no longer keep what they had, until she held the finest gathering of Russian imperial art anywhere outside Russia itself. Many thousands of objects spread across her houses, a private museum built by one American woman out of the ruins of a fallen empire. The heart of it was the work of Carl Fabergé, the jeweler to the Tsars, and Marjorie owned nearly 90 of his pieces. She owned 2 of the celebrated imperial eggs, the jeweled Easter eggs the last Tsars had given to the women of their own family, each one a small marvel of gold and translucent enamel and precious stones with a hidden surprise tucked inside. One of them, made in the 1890s, carried the monograms of a dead emperor and the widow who mourned him. The other, a delicate thing in rose and pink made in the last years before the fall, had once held a tiny mechanical figure of Catherine the Great, and it had come to Marjorie by the tenderest route imaginable. Her own daughter Eleanor had found it, bought it, and given it to her mother as a birthday present. Of all the treasures Marjorie ever owned, that one egg had reached her by the gentlest road of all, through the love of a child, a bright and precious thing handed from a daughter to a mother, and it took its place in the collection among the relics of a family that had been slaughtered together in a cellar. Laid out all at once, the scale of it is staggering. Nearly 90 works by the imperial jeweler, 2 of the imperial eggs, some 24 silver chalices from the Orthodox Church, one of the great small collections of Russian icons in all of America, the sacred images of a faith the Soviet state was busy trying to stamp out of existence, whole dinner services of imperial porcelain, some of it once eaten from by Catherine the Great herself. And at the dark center of the whole hoard, the wedding crown, the diamond nuptial crown of the Empress Alexandra, more than 1,500 diamonds sewn in rows onto a frame, made to crown a bride at an imperial wedding, worn by a woman who would be shot with her children a little over 2 decades later. Marjorie hung it in her house. She would leave it, in the end, to a museum, labelled forever as her bequest to the nation, a wedding crown given to the public by a woman on the far side of 4 failed weddings of her own. There is an uneasiness in this collection that Marjorie herself never quite spoke to, and it belongs in her story because it is part of who she was. She was buying the plunder of a murdered family from the very regime that had done the murdering. The treasures came cheap precisely because the people who had owned them were dead or in exile or dispossessed, and the men doing the selling were the men who had done the killing. Marjorie understood herself, through all of it, as a rescuer. She believed she was saving beautiful and sacred things from destruction and dispersal, preserving for the future a heritage that would otherwise be melted down for its gold or scattered to the winds. And there is real and solid truth in that belief. A great deal of what she bought would very likely have been lost forever had she not carried it away. In her own words, spoken years later, she came to feel that the collection should belong to the country. She had begun it, she said, simply for the joy of it, and only as it grew, and as others came to care about it, did she understand that it should belong to everyone. The museums that keep her story today tell it her way, as a tale of preservation, of a great collector who rescued a heritage from the fire. The other reading, the one the institutions leave mostly unspoken, is quieter and colder, that a fabulously wealthy foreigner walked through the aftermath of a massacre and bought the dead family's jewels at a discount from their killers. Both of those things are true at the very same time, and Marjorie lived inside both of them without any apparent difficulty, because the collector's instinct in her was total and untroubled. A thing of beauty and importance should be found, understood, catalogued, preserved, and set in its proper place. Where it had come from, and at what human cost, was a question that belonged to a different room of the mind, a room Marjorie had trained herself, ever since her father's death, to keep firmly shut. She had a way of talking about her fortune that set her apart from the idle rich she moved among. "There are others better off than I am," she once said. "The only difference is that I do more with mine. I move it around," she said, "and I put it to work." She meant it to the letter. The money was, to Marjorie, a tool, an engine, an obligation, never a thing to be hoarded and sat upon, and the collection was part of that same creed, a treasure she came to see as belonging less to her than to the country she would one day leave it to. She had gathered the scattered wreckage of one murdered empire, and she meant, in the end, to hand it whole to her own republic, so that anyone at all could walk in and stand before the glory a revolution had tried to sell off for scrap. The collecting itself was of a piece with everything else in her. The girl who had labelled jars and folded boxes had grown into a woman who gathered and sorted and kept on the grandest scale imaginable. Whole dinner services of imperial porcelain, rooms of French furniture, icons by the dozen, each object researched and catalogued and set precisely where it belonged. She built the collection the way she had built the company and the houses, by acquisition and by order, and it gave her something no husband ever quite did. It stayed. A porcelain service does not betray its owner. An icon does not grow old and bitter and have to be left behind. The treasures asked nothing of her and never once disappointed her, and perhaps that was part of why she loved them as fiercely as she did. The collection grew until it filled her houses and spilled past their walls, thousands upon thousands of objects, and she meant from early on for the whole of it to outlive her as something the public could share. She hung the icons and set out the imperial porcelain and displayed the jeweled eggs, and she began to shape a house in Washington expressly to hold it all, a house that would become, after her death, a museum. It was the collector's final ambition, larger even than the collecting itself, that the treasures she had carried out of a revolution should belong, in the end, to a whole country, rather than to a single family, open to any stranger who cared to come and look. She had gathered the glory of the dead. She meant, in time, to give it to the living. And while she filled her houses with the wedding treasures of the dead, her own marriage, the third one, the marriage that had carried her to Moscow and made the whole collection possible, was beginning its long and quiet failure. Joseph Davies had given her Russia and the treasures that crowned her life. He had also, it was slowly becoming clear, given her another version of the same disappointment she seemed to find waiting at the centre of every marriage, a man who wished to possess her more than to stand beside her as an equal, and who was aging in the years after Moscow into someone she found, to her own alarm, that she could not bear to be near. The treasures were permanent. She would keep them in flawless order for the rest of her days. The marriage was not permanent, and Marjorie, who could preserve a murdered empress's diamond crown for 30 years, was about to learn all over again that a living husband would not stay catalogued. Chapter 10. The husband she could not watch fail. She had built her entire life on the belief that the body answers to the will, that discipline and order and sheer determination could master very nearly anything, and she found that she could not stay married to a man who was visibly, and to her eye, almost unforgivably, failing. This is the quiet, unsettling truth at the centre of her third divorce, and it reveals something about Marjorie that the palaces and the philanthropy tend to keep hidden. She was a lifelong Christian Scientist, raised in the faith that had, as she believed, saved her own father when the doctors could not, and that faith carried within it a hard edge, a deep distrust of illness and frailty, a sense that the failing body was somehow a failure of the spirit that ran it. It made her formidable beyond measure. It also made her, when a husband began to decline in front of her, strangely and coldly unable to remain. There is something almost tragic in that inability, and it reaches all the way back to the beginning of her, to Battle Creek, and to the father whose broken nerves and failing body had frightened her as a child. She had been raised to believe that the mind governs the flesh, that sickness is a thing to be risen above by discipline and faith. And she had built a whole life on the refusal of weakness. It made her indomitable. It also left her without the ordinary human patience for decline, for the slow softening and failing that comes in the end for very nearly everyone. When Davies grew old and ill and sour, she saw in him, perhaps, the very thing she had spent her whole life outrunning, and she could not bring herself to settle in beside it. And so she left. The marriage had carried its strains from the start. Davies was a proud and possessive man who had married far up, and he wanted his brilliant wife's whole attention fixed upon him in a way she could not sustain. His public embrace of Stalin, in the book and the film that made him briefly famous, sat strangely beside her own private horror at what she had seen in Moscow, and though politics did not end the marriage, it marked the growing distance between them. A husband performing his admiration for a tyranny while his wife quietly kept the truth of it locked away. 20 years they lasted, the longest of her marriages, and in some ways the emptiest. Two people who had built a grand and glittering life together and grown, across the length of it, steadily further apart. Joseph Davies had never been an easy man to be married to, even at his best. He was possessive and jealous, a husband who wanted to hold his brilliant, restless wife close and keep her whole attention fixed upon himself. And Marjorie had spent years of the marriage managing his need to be the center of her world. He had made himself, in the years after Moscow, into a public defender of Stalin's regime, writing a best-selling book that excused the show trials and praised the Soviet dictator to a wartime American audience, a book that Hollywood turned into a film. Marjorie herself, by the accounts that survive, had been privately appalled by the police state she had lived inside, even as her husband praised it in print for all the world to read. And there is something telling in that gap between them. The wife who had seen the terror with clear eyes, and the husband who had talked himself into admiring it. But the marriage ended over age and illness, and Marjorie's inability to abide either, a thing simpler and sadder than any politics. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Davies grew old and sick and irritable, his health failing, his temper shortening. And Marjorie discovered that she could not do the thing a certain kind of wife was expected to do, could not settle in gently beside a declining man and nurse him tenderly toward his end. She had watched her own father's mind break, again and again, across her childhood. She had built an entire life on the refusal of frailty, on the conviction that will and order could hold anything at bay. And faced now with a husband who was becoming, in front of her eyes, a diminished and difficult old man, she chose to leave him. They divorced in 1955, after 20 years, the longest of her 4 marriages. And here the old pattern showed itself once again, the strange reversal that ran through every one of her divorces and set her apart from almost every other woman of her time. Because Marjorie was the fortune, the money did not flow the way the world expected it to flow when a marriage came apart. She was the one who held everything. And so when she left Joseph Davies, she settled property upon him, gave him one of their Washington estates as she went out the door, the departing wife enriching the husband she was leaving behind. It had been much the same with all of them in their various ways. She kept her palaces and her fortune and her name, and the men drifted out of her orbit carrying gifts. She was something the age had almost no template for, the woman who did the leaving, who held all the power that great money can give, and yet none of the power that love quietly withholds from every human being alike, rich and poor, man and woman, the same. There is a strange dignity in the way she left her marriages, and a strange sorrow folded inside it too. She never went to war over money, because the money was already hers, and she never played the wronged and abandoned wife, because she was never truly either of those things. She simply reached a private verdict that a marriage was finished, settled whatever needed settling, often with real generosity toward the man she was leaving, and moved on, keeping her name and her houses and her composure intact. It made her formidable, and it made her lonely, in almost equal measure, because a woman who needs nothing from a man that money can supply is a woman who can only ever be loved for the one thing money cannot buy, and that was the very thing she could never manage to hold on to. 3 marriages now, and 3 endings. The lawyer she had outgrown, the financier who had betrayed her, and now the diplomat she could not bear to watch fail. After each one, Marjorie did the very same thing. She put the pain away in its place. She organized her life around the fresh loss. And then, in time, she went looking all over again, because whatever it was that drove her, the old wound underneath the wound, it was not satisfied, and it would not let her stop and be still. She was in her late 60s now, 3 times divorced, richer and grander and more alone than she had ever been, mistress of more great houses than any one person could ever live in. And she was about to do the very thing that everyone around her assumed she had surely finished with for good. She was about to fall in love one final time, joyfully, headlong, at an age when most people have long since made their peace with solitude. The 4th marriage would be the strangest of them all. It would end with a set of photographs and a demand for money, and it would leave her, at the last, finally and forever, alone at the center of the palace she had built. Chapter 11. Walking on Fluffy Pink Clouds. At 71 years old, 3 times divorced, the richest woman in America fell in love once more, and she wired her granddaughter that she was walking on fluffy pink clouds. It is an image that ought to soften the hardest heart. This woman who had built and lost so much, who had every reason in the world to be guarded and careful, throwing herself one final time into the giddy happiness of a new love with all the abandon of a young girl. The man was Herbert May, a business executive from Pittsburgh, a patron of the opera and the ballet, a charming and cultured widower, and he was, in one respect, unlike any husband who had come before him. He was the poorest of the 4. There was no fortune on his side to speak of, and Marjorie, ever the organizer, simply arranged the money to smooth the difference between them, setting up a trust to provide for him, handling the practical side of things the way she handled everything, with quiet, total competence. For a while, it was pure delight, and the delight is documented in her own words, which is rare and precious in a woman who guarded her inner life so closely. She married Herbert May in the summer of 1958, in a ceremony at her daughter's country estate with the reception held at her Washington house, and she entered the marriage with an openness that is genuinely moving in a woman who had been so many times disappointed. When May, who loved to fly, first introduced her to travel by private plane, she decided on the spot that she simply must have one of her own. She told him plainly, in the middle of a flight, that she wanted an aircraft. And when he began, sensibly, to explain the great cost of such a thing, she cut him off cold. She had not asked how much it cost, she said. She wanted one, and she bought one. A fine turbo propeller plane, and she named it, of course, the Merriweather, after herself, after the family name that ran like a spine through her whole life. It is a perfect miniature portrait of her, that exchange, the imperial ease with money, the flat refusal to be told a thing was too dear, the sudden bright delight of a woman who had decided, against all her experience, to be happy again. The square dancing became the emblem of these late glittering years, and there is something wonderful and strange in the picture of it. Here was the richest woman in America, the mistress of 118 rooms, the owner of a Russian empire's worth of treasure. And what she loved, more than the opera or the ballet or any of the grand amusements her money could command, was to gather her guests in the great hall of Mar-a-Lago and call the figures of a country dance. A newspaper of the day announced that a new craze had swept Palm Beach and laid it squarely at her feet. She kept the floor turning late into the night, and she danced every dance she could, a woman in her 70s in a full bright skirt, clapping and laughing, even as her hearing failed and a servant had to lean in and tell her who had just come through the door. The Summers had their own splendour, up at the great camp in the Adirondacks, a rustic kingdom of some 70 buildings scattered along a wooded ridge above a cold northern lake. Guests were met far below and carried up the steep slope on a private railway to the lodge at the top, and each one was given a cabin with its own dedicated butler, so that even in the deep woods the standard never once slipped. There was a Russian-style lodge she had built as a gift for a husband, and boathouses down on the water, and a great room where films were shown against the dark, and a whole staff of guides and cooks and caretakers to keep it all running. It was wilderness staged as luxury, the forest itself arranged and ordered and made to serve. And it was one more place where Marjorie gathered people around her into beautiful rooms and presided, warm and exacting, over a happiness she could arrange for everyone in the world except herself. She was, for all her exacting standards, beloved by the people who worked for her, and that too belongs in the picture. She paid her enormous staff better than the going rate, dressed them well, kept them on where a lesser employer would have let them go, and treated the running of a great house as a serious and honourable craft. She left her guests a standing instruction that they were to do exactly as they pleased, regardless of the day's arrangements, and that if there was anything at all they wanted and did not ask for, the fault was entirely their own. She wanted, always, to give, to feed and house, and delight the people around her, to fill her enormous rooms with warmth and motion and music. And the more she filled them, the more visible became the one thing no guest and no servant and no square dance could ever supply: the empty chair at the head of the longest table, still waiting for a person who never came to stay. These were the glittering years at the very top of her long reign, and the houses had never blazed brighter. It was in this era that Marjorie made Palm Beach fall in love with square dancing, of all the improbable things, hosting evening after evening of it in the great rooms of Mar-a-Lago, the grande dame of American wealth calling the figures in a full skirt, keeping her guests turning and clapping, dancing every single dance herself, even as her hearing began to slip away from her. A society writer of the day announced that a new craze had swept Palm Beach and laid it squarely at Marjorie's feet. She held court through the long green summers at the great camp in the Adirondacks, where each guest cabin came with its own butler, and visitors were carried up the ridge on the private railway to the lodge at the top. And she left her guests a standing instruction that captures her exactly, that they were to do whatever they pleased, regardless of the day's planned amusements, and that if there was anything at all they wanted and did not ask for, the fault was entirely their own. She ran a household staff that numbered, across all her properties, something close to 300 people, paid better than the going wage, dressed in tailored uniforms and drilled to a standard of precision that had become legendary in her lifetime. Her butlers were said to set the great dinner table with yardsticks, measuring the exact distance between each plate and each piece of silver to be certain that everything sat precisely where it should, everything in its place. The whole enormous apparatus of her life was ordered down to the inch, every object where it belonged, every servant trained to the letter, every evening planned to the minute. A private world under a control so complete It was almost frightening to behold. And at the very center of all that flawless order sat a marriage she had been warned about before she ever entered into it. The people closest to her, including her own daughter Dina, had tried to tell her something about Herbert May before the wedding, something she had not wished to hear and had waved away as unkind gossip. They had suggested, as gently as such a thing can be suggested, that May's deepest attachments were not to women at all, that his easy charm concealed a private life that would never make room for a wife in the way Marjorie so plainly wanted. She dismissed it out of hand. He had been married before. He had fathered children. He seemed to her the warm and cultured companion she had been searching for her whole life. She had been alone for 3 years since the last divorce, and she had found a man who made her feel like a girl walking on pink clouds, and she was not about to let a few ugly whispers take him from her. But the whispers were true, and the truth was already on its way to her, and it would arrive in the cruelest form imaginable, as a blackmailer's envelope, dropped onto the desk of a woman who had spent her whole life believing that if she only held her world in flawless order, nothing in it could ever truly take her by surprise. Chapter 12. The Photographs by the Pool. A set of photographs arrived on her desk, and with them a demand for money, and the fourth marriage ended exactly the way all the others had, with Marjorie standing alone at the center of a palace full of servants and empty of the one thing she had married to find. The photographs showed her husband, Herbert May, at the pool at Mar-a-Lago, in the company of young men, in poses that left nothing whatever to be misunderstood. A blackmailer had gotten hold of them, and now wanted to be paid to keep them quiet. And Marjorie, confronted at last with proof she could neither organize away nor refuse to look at, understood that the thing she had been warned about, the thing she had waved off as gossip before the wedding, had been true from the very beginning. What followed, in the account left by her biographer, is one of the most quietly devastating exchanges in the whole of her story, and it turns on a single small question. As the truth came out into the open, Marjorie learned that the people around her, her family, her intimates, her own daughter, had known, or at the least strongly suspected, all along. Dina, the actress, had been one of those who tried to warn her before the wedding. And when the full picture finally came clear, Dina, astonished, asked her mother the obvious thing. "You mean you did not know?" And Marjorie, equally astonished from the other direction, answered that of course she had not known, and then turned the question straight back, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You mean you did?" There it is. The whole loneliness of the woman caught in 2 short lines. The one who prided herself on knowing everything, on missing nothing, on keeping every fact and figure and household detail in perfect order, had been the very last person in her own circle to understand her own marriage. Everyone around her had seen it. She had not. She had built a life on the faith that total control meant total knowledge, and she had been blind in the one place where blindness cost the most. The marriage ended in 1964, after 6 years, the shortest of the 4. And here, at the last, Marjorie showed the quality that redeems her, the thing that keeps her from being merely an imperious woman collecting husbands the way she collected eggs and icons. She refused to be cruel. She had every reason in the world for bitterness, and every social license to destroy the man who had humiliated her, and she did none of it. When Herbert May fell seriously ill some years later, suffering a stroke, Marjorie quietly paid his medical bills and gave him a place to live out his days. The husband who had betrayed her, whose secret had cost her the last of her hopes of marriage, was cared for at the end by the very woman he had wronged. It was of a piece with everything generous that ran in her, the same instinct that had fed the hungry through the depression and would give her treasures to the nation. She could not always be loved the way she longed to be loved. She could always be decent. And she was. 4 marriages and 4 endings, and a pattern she surely saw by now, even if she could never quite explain it. The lawyer she had outgrown, the financier who had betrayed her with a servant, the diplomat she could not bear to watch decline, and now a 4th husband whose whole heart had always been turned toward a place she could not follow. Each time she had married in the full and genuine belief that this one would be the one that held, that this time she would finally build the partnership she craved. Each time the belief had failed her, and the strangest thing in all of it is that she had done, in nearly every case, the leaving and the ending herself, and still she was the one left alone at the close, because a woman can end 4 marriages and be, when the last door shuts, exactly as unaccompanied as if every man had walked out on her. She would not marry a 5th time, though she was said, even near the very end, to have toyed with the idea, because the wanting in her never entirely died. But the wanting had learned by now what it would and would not be given. She had reached 4 separate times for the one thing her fortune could never command, and 4 separate times it had slipped through her fingers, and she was old now, and the reaching was finished. What remained was the empire she had built to house a happiness that never quite arrived, and she settled into the middle of it, the mistress of everything and the companion of no one. But decency is a cold blanket on a long winter night, and when the door finally closed on the 4th marriage, Marjorie Post was truly and permanently alone, and she was old now, and she was not going to marry again. 4 times she had stood at an altar. 4 times she had believed, with the full formidable force of her will, that this time she would build the partnership she craved, the equal at her side, the person who was hers at the very center of everything she had made. 4 times it had come apart in her hands, and the palaces had only grown larger and grander around the growing emptiness at their heart. And so, the room comes into focus. The room the whole ascent had been building toward. The long table set with an emperor's gilded plates, measured to the inch. The footmen standing silent against the walls. The food arriving in perfect order from a kitchen of trained staff. And at the head of it all, a woman in her 70s, going deaf, dressed as if for a state occasion, dining entirely alone. That is where the whole long ascent had led. She had organized the grains of sand. She had built the greatest private house in America, and she sat in the middle of it by herself, and there was no longer anyone left to catch in a lie, or to wire from an airplane, or to lose. There was only the palace, and the treasures of the dead, and the vast, ordered, humming silence. And Marjorie at the center of a world she ruled completely and shared with no one at all. Chapter 13. The Queen alone in the ballroom. In her last years she went deaf, and a butler stood at her shoulder to announce each guest by name, so that the woman who had everything need never seem, even for a single moment, to have no one. It is the detail that says the most about the end of her long life, that small, careful act of staged grace. Marjorie was losing her hearing, and rather than let a guest arrive and find her unable to greet them properly, she had a servant murmur each name to her as they came through the door, so that she could turn and welcome every visitor warmly, correctly, by name, the perfect hostess to the very last. The emptiness underneath it all managed as carefully as everything else she had ever managed. She was still in her 80s, throwing the great parties. She was still calling the square dances at Mar-a-Lago in a full skirt, still dancing every dance she could, still presiding over the summer camp in the mountains and the winter palace by the sea. The rain never once abdicated. It only grew quieter at the very center of it. The apparatus around her stayed magnificent to the end. She employed something close to 300 people across her houses, paid better than the going wage, dressed in tailored uniforms, trained to a standard no grand hotel could match. Her butlers set the table with yardsticks, measuring the space between the plates and the silver so that everything sat exactly where it was meant to sit. She served her dinners on gilded plates that had once belonged to an emperor of Austria. She ran the whole enormous machine of her life with the same total control she had brought to it since she was a girl, folding boxes in a barn. And the control was real, and it reached almost everywhere, into every corner of every house. And it stopped at exactly one place, at the chair set beside her own. Those who knew her in these years describe a woman still utterly in command, still rising to a fixed schedule, still dressing for dinner as though a president might arrive at any moment, still giving with both hands. A granddaughter would remember her in the end, less for the grandeur than for the generosity, a woman who loved to share what she had and was never once embarrassed by the size of her fortune. And yet the grandeur and the giving could not quite cover the shape of the thing. She had outlived or outlasted every husband. Her daughters had lives and marriages and distances of their own. She was at the very summit of everything a person can acquire, increasingly and unmistakably alone, and she met that solitude the only way she knew, by keeping the whole magnificent apparatus of her life running in flawless order, so that the emptiness at the center of it need never once show its face to a guest. Age came for her the way it comes for everyone, even the ones who have spent a lifetime refusing to believe in it. Her hearing failed. Her body, the body she had always trusted to obey her will, began its slow retreat. But she met it the way she met everything, with routine and discipline and unbowed style, rising to her schedule, dressing with full ceremony, keeping the great houses running and the great parties turning. She had spent her whole life building a fortress of order against the chaos that had taken her father. And now, in her 80s, deaf and alone at the very top of it, she manned the walls of that fortress to the last, greeting her guests by borrowed names, calling the dances she could no longer quite hear, holding the line against the emptiness with nothing left but her own indomitable will. There is a single exchange from these late years that lands the whole story in a handful of words, and it is documented, and it came from a man who knew her well, the chairman of her own great company. He looked at her one day, this woman who had built and run and mastered so much, and he asked her the question that everyone who had ever watched her must have wanted to ask. "Marjorie," he said, "you could run General Motors. You could run United States Steel. You are the smartest woman I know. Why do you have so much trouble with husbands?" And Marjorie, who had buried her father and outgrown one husband and trapped another and left a third and been quietly ruined by a fourth, reached for no grand answer. She shrugged. "I honestly do not know," she said. "Ain't it hell?" That was the whole of it. The sharpest woman in America, the mistress of the greatest houses in the country, the collector who could catalogue an empire, and on the one subject that had defied her across her entire life, she had no theory and no system and no solution, only a shrug and a plain, rueful, Midwestern phrase. Ain't it hell? And here is the very heart of it, and it asks something of you. Picture yourself walking into that dining room at Mar-a-Lago on an evening near the end. The tower stands 75 feet above you against the soft Florida dark. The tiles beneath your feet are 500 years old. The plates on the table were made for an emperor. The footmen stand silent against the walls. The flowers are perfect. The silver is measured to the inch. And at the head of the longest private table in Palm Beach sits an old woman in her gown and her jewels, dressed as though for a coronation, and there is no one across from her, and no one at her side. and the butler leans in to tell her your name so that she can smile and greet you, because she can no longer hear you come. That is what all of it was for. That is the room the fortune built. She had wanted, more than any company or crown or collection could ever give her, one single person who was permanently, unshakably hers at the center of the world she made. And she sat at the center of it alone, and greeted her guests by borrowed names, and called the next dance, and kept the whole magnificent, sorrowful machine running, right up until the day her own body, the body she had always believed must answer to her will, at last began to fail. Chapter 14. The Palace a Nation Refused. She died in the autumn of 1973, and she left her greatest palace to the United States of America, and the United States decided it could not afford to keep it. She died on the 12th of September at Hillwood, her house in Washington, 86 years old, her heart giving out at the last after a long decline, and her will, when it was read, revealed the final ambition of a woman who had spent her whole life building things too large for any private person to hold. She had decided exactly what Mar-a-Lago was for. It was to become the winter White House of the United States, a retreat for presidents, a place where the leaders of the nation could receive the world in a setting worthy of the country's power and permanence. She left the whole vast estate to the federal government for precisely that purpose, the crowning gift of a lifelong patriot who had fed the hungry and equipped a wartime hospital and given away a fortune, offering her country the greatest house she had ever built. It was the last and largest gesture of a lifetime of them. She had already given her country a war hospital and a depression canteen and concert halls and a fortune in jewels, and now, at her death, she gave it a palace, the grandest private house in America, meant to serve the highest office in the land. She had ordered the rest of her estate with the same care she brought to everything else, providing for her daughters, endowing her museum, remembering old institutions and old causes by name. The will read like the final inventory of a life spent gathering and giving in equal measure. Everything counted, everything assigned, everything set down and accounted for in the world she was leaving behind. And at the very head of the list stood Mar-a-Lago, her masterpiece, offered up whole to the nation. And the government took it, and then the government discovered the very thing Marjorie had known and simply absorbed for half a century, that a palace of 118 rooms is a devouring thing, a mouth that swallows money without end. The cost of heating it, and cooling it, and securing it, and staffing it, and holding it against the salt and the sun, was more than the government cared to bear for a house that presidents, as it turned out, did not particularly want to use. And so, a few years after her death, the United States handed Mar-a-Lago back. An act of Congress returned the greatest private house in America to the foundation she had left behind, because the richest nation on earth had looked at the arithmetic and decided that Marjorie Post's palace was simply too expensive to own. The irony is exact, and it can stand without any decoration at all. The woman had built, out of breakfast cereal money, a house so grand that she meant it for presidents. She had given it to her country as a gift, freely, in her will. And her country had looked at the gift and declined it out of plain arithmetic, with no ingratitude in it at all, because not even the government of the United States could comfortably afford to live the way Marjorie Post had lived. The palace went back to her foundation, and then, in 1985, it passed into the hands of a brash young developer from New York named Donald Trump, for a sum that was a fraction of what it had cost her to build it, furnishings and all. The house she had raised as a monument to permanence and offered to the nation as a seat of power. slipped back into private hands for a fraction of what it had cost to raise, and went on to a second life she could never have imagined and did not live to see. There is a temptation to make the sale into a fable about the man who bought it, but the truer and sadder point belongs to Marjorie. She had built a house so far beyond the scale of ordinary human life that no family, and in the end no government, could sustain it. The palace was a monument to a way of living that was already passing away even as she died, the age of the great private fortunes and their courts of hundreds of liveried servants, and when that age closed, the palace became an orphan, too vast and too costly for the plainer century that inherited it. She had built it to stand forever. In the end, it could not even be given away. Her estate ran to the better part of $200 million, and she had disposed of it with the thoroughness of a woman who left nothing whatever to chance. The bulk of the fortune went to her 3 daughters. Institutions she had loved for decades received their bequests by name. Her jewels, her houses, her collection, all of it was assigned and directed and placed. The last great act of ordering by a woman who had spent her whole life arranging the world around her. She had come into a fortune at 27 through the worst loss of her life, and she left one behind at 86, larger and more storied than the one she inherited, scattered now by her own careful hand across her children, and her causes, and her country. That was the fate of the greatest of her houses, the one the story promises from its very first frame, the palace she built and was left alone inside and then gave away. But it was only the first stone in a whole long scattering. For all her genius at keeping things in order, at holding and preserving and controlling, the empire of houses she had so carefully assembled would not stay assembled once she was gone from it. One by one, the places she had ordered so perfectly slipped out of her family's hands and went their separate ways, and the pattern of her marriages repeated itself now in brick and stone and Adirondack timber. She had built every one of them to keep. Almost none of them stayed kept. Chapter 15. The empire scattered to strangers. One by one, the houses she had ordered so perfectly slipped out of her family's hands, and the only one that came to rest as she had wished was the one she had always meant to give away. Hillwood, her Washington estate, was the house she died in. Marjorie had bought it years before with a museum already fixed in her mind, had filled it with the Russian treasures and the French furniture and the wedding crown of the murdered empress, and she left it with a great endowment attached to the Smithsonian, the nation's own museum, so that the public could one day walk through her rooms and see what she had gathered. And the Smithsonian, weighing the cost of the place against the size of the endowment, did the very thing the government had done with Mar-a-Lago. It declined the gift as too expensive to keep. But here, and only here, the story turned her way. Her foundation took Hillwood back and did with it exactly what Marjorie had intended from the first day. They opened it to the public as a museum, and it stands today as Hillwood Estate, Museum and Gardens, holding the largest collection of Russian imperial art anywhere outside Russia, the Fabergé and the icons and the chalices and the diamond nuptial crown, all of it preserved and displayed, and open to anyone at all who wishes to come and see it, precisely as she had planned. Of all her houses, the one she meant to give away is the one that survived as hers. The palaces she meant to keep are the ones that got away from her. And of all the ironies in her long life, that one may be the kindest. The house she built to be a museum became a museum. The collection she rescued from a revolution and meant for the public became the public's, and stands open to this day, room after room of imperial splendor gathered by a woman from Battle Creek, the largest such trove anywhere outside Russia itself. When the crowds move through Hillwood now, past the icons and the porcelain and the rescued imperial gold. They are walking through the one wish of Marjorie's that time actually chose to grant. She had wanted to be remembered as a woman who had saved something and given it away. In Hillwood, at least, she got exactly that, because the rest did get away. The great camp in the Adirondacks, that rustic empire of 70 buildings strung along the ridge with a butler for every cabin, she left to the state of New York, and the state found it, like all the others, too costly to run, and put it up for auction, and it sold in 1985 for around $911,000. A whole rustic kingdom knocked down to a private buyer with a bid. The grandest of her jewels went to the Smithsonian and remain there still. Among them, a great diamond necklace once made for the wife of Napoleon, and a pair of earrings said to have belonged to Marie Antoinette, imperial and royal treasures handed by a serial heiress to her nation. The vast 54-room apartment in New York had been given up long before. The great sailing ship had passed years earlier to a Caribbean dictator in trade for an airplane, and sailed on into other hands and under other flags. The empire dissolved, piece by piece by piece, in much the way her marriages had dissolved, and for much the same underlying reason, that the sheer scale of what she had built was finally too great for anyone, even a government, to hold on to. What survived best of everything she made had no walls at all, and it was the giving. Marjorie Post had spent her whole life pouring money out into the world around her, and that steady current outlasted every roof she ever raised. There was the field hospital she equipped in the First World War. There was the great canteen she paid for through the worst years of the Depression, feeding something like 1,000 hungry people every single day, and doing it with a dignity she flatly insisted upon. The women and children waiting for their meals in a warm room and served at a proper table rather than standing in a line out on the cold street. There was the concert pavilion that still carries her family name, and the more than $1 million she gave to the National Symphony, and the free concerts she funded, so that school children who would never own a Fabergé egg could at least hear the music. There was the college built on the grounds of one of her old estates, named for her father, carrying the Post name forward into the education of generations who would never know or care where the money had first come from. She had been raised in the faith that great wealth carries a great obligation, and whatever the fortune failed to buy her in her own private life, she turned an enormous share of it outward, toward strangers, right to the very end. The honours had come to her across a lifetime, though she never seemed to gather them the way she gathered everything else. France had made her a commander of its Legion of Honour. She had given to the founding of the great National Centre for the Arts that would one day carry a president's name, and to the Scouts, and to hospitals and colleges and orchestras beyond any easy counting. She had fed the hungry with dignity, armed a war with beds and bandages, and filled a museum with the rescued glory of a fallen world. Whatever the fortune had failed to buy her in private, in public, it did an enormous and lasting amount of good, and she had directed nearly all of it herself, with the very same hand that measured the place settings and catalogued the icons. And her daughters carried the name forward into the world. The eldest two, Adelaide and Eleanor, lived long lives and married many times over between them, more times in the end than their mother ever had. The youngest, Nadinia, the girl born in the glittering 1920s, became the actress Dina Merrill and made a public name entirely her own in the movies and on television. The one child of Marjorie Post, whom the wider world would recognize on sight. They were, by the honest accounts, not an easy family, a mother of towering standards and daughters who kept their distance in the ways that the children of towering mothers so often do. Dinah herself would say that her parents never truly supported the life she chose, that her ambitions were her own and not the ones they had held for her. and that she had gone out and earned her own way rather than lean on the family money. Dina Merrill went on to a long career all her own, 100 roles and more across the movies and television, a genuine star spun off from the great serial fortune. Her sisters married and married again, more times between the two of them than their mothers' 4, restless women born to a restless mother. The honest accounts do not pretend it was a close or an easy family. It endured all the same, carrying the Post name and the Post story forward. And it gave the wider world, in Dina, a face to attach to a fortune most people had eaten their way through at breakfast for generations without once stopping to think of the woman behind the box. But they were hers, and they survived her. And through Dina especially, something of Marjorie went on being watched and admired by a public that had no idea it was looking at the granddaughter of a Battle Creek cereal salesman. Chapter 16. All my hope rests in myself. In the center of a rose garden in Washington stands a stone urn of deep purple, and the words carved beneath it are the truest she ever chose. Marjorie Merriweather Post was laid to rest at Hillwood, the house she gave to the public, in the garden at its very heart, under a monument topped by an antique urn of dark porphyry. And on the base of it, beneath her coat of arms, there is a motto set in Latin, and rendered into plain English, it says one quiet and devastating thing. All my hope rests in myself. In myself lies all my hope. There is a whole life folded into the choice of those words to stand over her forever. She could have chosen a line of scripture about love, or the name of a husband, or the name of a child. She chose instead a flat declaration of absolute self-reliance, made by a woman who had married 4 separate times, reaching for someone to lean upon, and who had learned, across 4 separate failures, that in the end there was no one to lean upon but herself. It reads at first like pure strength, and it is strength, the hard-won creed of a formidable survivor. And underneath the strength, it reads like the saddest confession a life could possibly make, because a person only carves those words over her own grave once everyone she ever reached for is already gone. All my hope rests in myself. It was true. It was true because, in the end, nothing else had held. She had organized the grains of sand, exactly as her father said she would. She had organized a small cereal company into the largest food empire in the nation. She had organized a palace of 118 rooms, and a sailing ship, and a mountain camp of 70 buildings, and a household of 300 souls measured to the inch. She had organized the scattered treasures of a murdered dynasty into the finest collection of its kind anywhere outside the country that lost them. She had put everything in its place. The one thing that would never stay in its place, the one acquisition that slipped the catalogue every single time, was a husband, a partner, an equal at the center of it all. She had built the greatest private palace in America. The palace was never the prize the story seemed to promise. It was the evidence, and the size of it was the exact measure of how alone she was inside it. The grander the rooms grew, the emptier the chair beside her. That is the deepest truth of her long life, and she seems to have understood it at the last, well enough to carve it into stone. Everything she could seize by will, she seized. A company, when the world insisted a woman could not run one. A palace, when a cottage would have housed her. The treasures of dead emperors, the largest ship on the sea. A household ordered to the fraction of an inch. She mastered every arena the age would let a woman enter, and several it swore she could not. And she did all of it without the equal partner she had spent 60 years reaching for. The self-reliance carved on her tombstone reads at first like a boast of triumph, and it is really the plainest possible truth of a life that had taught her, marriage after marriage, that in the end, she would simply have to be enough, all by herself, because no one else had ever quite stayed. And so the story comes back to where it began, to the long table and the woman seated at the head of it. A hostess going deaf, greeting her guests by names, a servant whispered in her ear, in a room built for 100, dining alone. Behind her, the emperor's gilded plates. In a house up in Washington, the wedding crown of a woman shot dead for being an empress. A bride's crown kept forever by a woman who could not stay a bride. Marjorie Merriweather Post owned all of it, every tile and treasure and acre, and she gave a great deal of it away to a country that could not afford it, and a public that walks through her rooms to this day. She had access to everything the world could offer and lasting hold of almost none of the things that make a life warm. She kept the crown of a marriage that was never hers. She kept the palace and lost the people. And when the time came to choose the last words that would stand over her in the rose garden forever, she did not pretend, and she did not reach for comfort. All my hope rests in myself. She had learned it the hard way, in 118 rooms, at the head of a table set for one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay close, because I bring back the women whose private cost the world never counted underneath the glamour. And tell me this. If you could have Marjorie's fortune and her palaces, but only at the price she paid for them, would you take the trade? Tell me where you are watching from, and I will read every reply.